Hi there, I'm Nina Matei, and I selected the 1775 Newfoundland Hurricane as my case study. I hadn't heard of this storm before, and I thought it would give me some insight into how the colonial folks of America dealt with natural disasters. In his 1963 book, Early American Hurricanes, David Ludlam dubbed the storm the Independence Hurricane of 1775 because it struck North Carolina on September 2nd, just as the opening maneuvers of the War of Independence were in progress. Ludlam also noted that 4,000 people were killed, which is higher than any previous American mainland hurricane. And this is one that raged from North Carolina to Newfoundland. The storm remains one of the top 10 deadliest hurricanes in U.S. history. There's also a Canadian perspective, which Alan Ruthman notes that Canadians tend to not really dwell upon their disasters, but he notes that there's some good reasons to try to understand the full range of natural catastrophes that beset a nation from time to time, because these extreme events can provide guidance in building defenses against future occurrences. So according to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the effects of the 1775 Newfoundland hurricane began on August 29th, and they lasted through September 2nd of 1775. This savage hurricane raged from North Carolina to Newfoundland. Heavy rains began to fall across the colonies on August 29th and slowly increased with time. The coast was ravaged from Currituck to Chintiga. Wharves and storehouses on the waterfront of Norfolk were devastated. Bridges were carried away by raging waters. At Williamsburg, mill dams broke and corn stalks were blown flat. The wind blew furiously until 10 p.m. Many ships were damaged that were in the harbors, and even at Norfolk and Hampton Roads, another 25 ships were run ashore, and they were considered total losses. The gunship HMS Mercury, which was now an enemy vessel, was driven hard aground at Portsmouth around 5 p.m. on the 2nd of September. And it was stranded in 2 feet of water for about 8 days. The Liberty became hopelessly stranded also in Back River near Hampton, and a number of locals boarded the ship, captured her crew, secured her goods, and set the ship afire as the first outright act of war in the War of Independence. A full blockade of Hampton Roads therefore brought shipping to a halt for 3 months, and at least 25 people died due to the shipwreck. 9 days later, on September 11 and 12, a violent southeaster slammed into the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland, killing hundreds of fishermen, sinking and damaging dozens of boats and vessels, including 2 Navy schooners. Shore facilities suffered extensively, too, from the wind and the huge water. At Placentia, which stood directly in the path of the storm, many survived only by scrambling into the rafters of their homes, as the wind drove floodwaters 3 and 4 feet deep through the town. For most of the inhabitants, the suffering was really pretty great. People who wrote about the event later said that there was evidence and signs of dread and horror everywhere. And there was more than 200 fishing boats which were sunk along with all of their crew members. The sea rose 20 feet above the usual height, which threw onshore hundreds of craft, both large and small. It's calculated that 300 people died. Rear Admiral Roger Duff, governor of Newfoundland, reported to the Earl of Dartmouth that 2 of His Majesty's armed schooners belonging to the squadron under his command, one of which was stationed at the times on the banks and the other on the northeast coast of Newfoundland, were unfortunately wrecked, but happily only 2 people of the crew were lost. In the days that followed the hurricane, the devastation was seen again and again. Fishermen would throw their large nets out into the water, and when they retrieved them, there'd be 20 and 30 dead bodies in the nets. And then settlers who had buried hundreds and hundreds of bodies said that for years afterwards, bones continued to wash ashore. So back to the case study, which concentrates on Virginia and North Carolina. The case study mentions that more than 4,000 people were killed by the hurricane, which is an enormous amount for any storm, and that got me to thinking about the populations of the colonies in 1775. The U.S. Census Bureau reports that the colonies conducted sporadic population counts and estimates before 1790, when the first official United States Census was taken. The pre-Republic census data are at best estimates, and completeness of data and universal reporting cannot be verified. For Virginia, the population count, which Thomas Jefferson had a hand in compiling and estimating, stands at about 557,000 people. 296,000 were free population, and about 270,000 were enslaved populations. In the colonial and continental eras, each colony reported population data in different forms and on different timelines. No thorough enumeration was ever made of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia during the continental and colonial eras, according to the U.S. Census. All the figures provided before the 1790 census are estimates. The North Carolina data from 1774 report a total population of 260,000 people in North Carolina. Looking at other data of that era, between 16 and 22% of North Carolina's population were enslaved. So I think that the slave population probably continued to increase, and I calculated it at 25%, or 65,000 people in 1774. This critique follows the 4 phases of the case study for the 1775 Newfoundland Hurricane, and it provides a conclusion and a lessons learned. The case study bounces back and forth between the realities of colonial era and then the realities of modern emergency management, but I think that the basic concepts fit pretty well. What we don't know is the type of planning that the colonial governments actually conducted, and what they did to make themselves ready for natural disasters aside from seasonal weather changes and severe weather of that type. But having a plan that is well known to town and city officials is critical, and communications in the larger cities and more developed colonies would have relied on word of mouth, handbills, newspapers, citizens on foot and on horseback, and it would have been a pretty reliable system of communication. The limiting factor is having no reliable weather forecasting system. So alerts would have been issued only a short time before the storm's full force would have been upon them. The other factor that we can't really completely understand is how self-sufficient and how isolated the population was at the time. Small farmers and large landowners would not have looked to the government for assistance, but neighbors would have supported each other in normal situations and in emergencies. The case study presents the concepts of energy in the form of horse, mule, human, and human-powered water and wind power as well. And these would have all been critical in the ability to move resources from vulnerable areas to safety for post-storm use. As the colonies began to realize how powerful and large the hurricane was, their need for up-to-date information, situational assessments, became more critical. Relying on power from animals, humans, water, and wind would have meant that shifting their resources out of harm's way would take a long time and be a relatively slow process. What's difficult to imagine is that the colonists relied on what they had right there in front of them. They had no imagination about steam power or electricity or gasoline engines. What the southern colonies did have was an enormous amount of human power in their enslaved populations. Without a doubt, the slave population contributed greatly to securing households, shoring up infrastructure, evacuating people, and moving resources. The case study also describes how the colonies maintained a common operating picture that was both official and unofficial. And in a way, it might have been kind of like FEMA news releases that are the official documentation, the official information, and personal Twitter accounts that really get the word out there to the population. For the colonists, relying on information, trying to get their information back and forth to their first responders, trying to keep their public informed, and then trying to make sense of the reports that they were receiving, it would have been a slow process. Coverage would have been hit and miss. And we know even with our modern communication systems, we rely on layers of redundant equipment and redundant systems, and we know that even all of our messages don't reach all of the intended audiences. As the hurricane moves across the region, damage reports reveal the devastation to farms, the destroyed crops, and the new threat from dam failures and flooding. The colonies needed to inspect the damage, get engineering reports on those vulnerable dams, recruit skilled workers, and assemble the raw materials for the repairs. But rescuers had to continue doing their job as well, so those citizens couldn't be pulled from the rescue detail to go work on construction projects. There was also a growing danger of more damage from those breached dams and the risks to the population and to the livestock for potential flooding. So all of that means that there's more evacuations. People have to move out of harm's way. More animals have to be moved out of harm's way from at-risk areas. And this increases the need for food, shelter, water, medicine for a growing number of evacuees. And it would have been a challenge to provide enough advance notice and enough warning so that people could evacuate effectively, whether it was in densely populated areas or low-lying coastal areas. And the other thing is that, in the colonial era, there wasn't an organized network of host and risk shelters that had been inspected and staffed and stocked and were ready to receive evacuees. In the colonial era, churches and meeting houses and private homes and inns or hostels would have been the place that people sought and were provided shelter. And many people would have provided their own food and water and their own medical care as well. So at this point, there's a growing concern of taking care of people who are injured and people who are sick, those who have died. There's a need to maintain sanitation, to control the spread of disease, and to provide dignified and timely burials. And really, these are familiar priorities that emergency response and recovery that we face every day still. So as the storm moves on out of the area, the ongoing concern still is for food and housing, for medical care, disease control, and burials. But also, the colonies are going to ask their neighbors and other colonies for assistance, and they're also going to call up the military or the militia, which may help provide extra workers and assure the residents that they're being taken care of. As traumatized residents began to regain their lives in normalcy, the government continues to provide simple and direct messages. We don't know what government leaders were expected to do in these situations. Were they expected to visit the stricken area? Were they expected to talk with people and get firsthand accounts? Or is that something that's more of a modern political phenomenon? But what they did need is they needed accurate and timely updates. And again, it was that formal and informal network. What they had to do is they had to help the residents know what was happening, both nearby and further away. And those couriers would have continued to bring reports from the affected areas, which the residents would have needed for their decision to return home, to take stock of their homes and their farms, and to rebuild if necessary. The colonies had to deal with many of the same issues in emergency situations that we face today. Shelter, food, water, medical care, damage assessments, repairs, management of animals, both large animals and small animals. Their communication networks, their raw materials, their human resources, and their material resources all would have supported their independent minded, self-sufficient outlook. But they would have returned to their homes and farms as soon as possible to get back on their feet. Their survival literally would have depended on getting back on their own 2 feet or moving on to establish a new life. The dam failures that complicated this disaster are similar in some ways to Hurricane Katrina, in which the hurricane was severe enough, but the floods compacted the impact and the recovery was made even more difficult. And then really the modern notion of having an accurate hazard, threat, and vulnerability assessment and then having realistic response plans would have been mirrored in the colonial era, but it would have been at a more basic level. It wouldn't have had as many specifics and as elaborate details on coordination and response. But in terms of personal preparedness, kind of having a family disaster plan, colonial residents would have been aware of the natural threats in their area, along with the infrastructure that was vulnerable and at risk. And that's things like wooden buildings that are vulnerable to fire, and earth and rock dams that are likely to fail, lakes and rivers that they know are going to flood every season. And then, of course, they can expect heat and cold and other severe weather. But their self-sufficient attitude would have meant that the colonists took care of themselves and supported each other. And I think rarely would they have truly looked to their community leaders for organized plans and assistance in disasters. So I hope that you've enjoyed the case study. I enjoyed learning more about this hurricane in the colonial era. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks.